السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته السيدات والسادة مشاهدات ومشاهدي قناة سودان بكرة. نحييكم في الجزء الثاني من برنامج وإن طال السفر للحديث عن النزاع في أثيوبيا الشقيقة في منطقة التقراي. ومعنا في هذا اللقاء الدكتور أبراهام زرعي الصحفي الإريتري مقيم بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ومدافع عن حقوق الإنسان. الأستاذة أيانتو أيانا طالبة دكتوراه في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وناشطة أثيوبية من الأورومو. الأستاذ فيصل الباقر صحفي ومدافع عن حقوق الإنسان ومقيم في نيروبي بكينيا. والدكتورة أميرة أحمد أستاذة بالجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة والخبيرة في شؤون اللاجئين. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for participating in this episode. And the second part will begin by the blockade, the internet and communications blockade, not only in Tigray, but this is something that we've seen occurring in Ethiopia frequently. Ustaz Faisal, what do you have to say about this blockade?
Well, I have to say one thing. First of all, in all our constitutions, we can see that there is a phrase, a word, article speaks about right to information. And now we are in the age of internet. So right to information, it's people's rights. This is number one. Secondly, in the Africa, there is Africa People Human Rights Commission and African Charter. Also, it speaks about right to information. Internationally, the Human Rights Declaration and all the human rights, they speak about right to information. So whenever I see or I observe that there is a blockage of internet, it means there is something wrong going on there. Why governments block the internet? This is a question which is very simple to be answered. They don't want the people to know, and also they don't want the international or the world to know what is happening there. So this issue of blockage of internet, we have experienced it in Sudan during the sittings on the 3rd of June massacre of 2019. We have observed it historically in Sudan, where the government, the previous regime, when they used to go to Darfur, Blue Nile, Nuba Mountains, first of all, they block the internet, they get down the internet, and they fight. called, I mean, always there will be a war between the central government and the regional governments, or the central and the opposition, or the whatever they call them. There is a human rights abuse happening somewhere there. So the right of internet must be respected. The right to information must be respected. And it's not a matter because of just of information. Imagine there are some poor people. They can't communicate between a village to a village, between a town to a town, between city to a city, between region to a region. Forget about those who are in the diaspora and they want to communicate with their families and extra. So we should always think of right of information. And whenever the internet is blocked or is cut, we should raise up our voices and say, hey, stop here, this is wrong.
Thank you, Ustaz Faisal. And let me add that, well, unfortunately, although as one of the lessons learned after the massacre of the 3rd of June in Sudan, the right to communications was mandated in the constitutional document that governs the transitional period of Sudan. Despite this, the transitional government unfortunately shut the internet down in more than 2 or 3 incidents in Sudan during the conflicts in Port Sudan and in Kassala. So this is a continuation of what the previous regime was doing. Ayanto, so what we know now, everyone is saying that this blockade of communications and internet in the Tigray region. But you said that, well, this is not unique to the Tigray. And can you just shed some more lights on this?
Well, like other authoritarian governments on the continent, the EPRDF shut down communication systems very frequently, especially during the years of the Oromo protests. They shut down the internet and sometimes the phone lines. Under Abiy Ahmed, the internet has been shut down at least half a dozen. And I'm being safe and saying just at least half a dozen times. In Oromia, in Western Oromia, where Abiy Ahmed has been waging a war against the people, the internet and the phone lines have been down for over a year. And when Oromo artist Hachalu Hundessa was assassinated this summer, the government shut down the internet for 3 or 4 weeks, basically creating, rampant mis and disinformation to flourish. And the central government shuts down the communication for the same reason. It's to maintain monopoly over the narrative, because each of these, in Western Oromia, for example, the government says that it's fighting insurgents, but people there say that they are committing extrajudicial killings, they are burning people's houses. So it's a way for the government to maintain its own narrative. And the first thing they did in Tigray was to shut down the communication. And that has allowed the government to really control, or to try to control, how people understand, even using very specific words, saying this is a law enforcement operation, setting up their own fact-check Twitter accounts. So you can see very involved strategies to ensure that only the government has control over the narrative. Of course, because of the internet and other people having access to it, they have not been very successful in completely shutting out everybody else. But they have maintained that control in Tigray.
Thank you, Ayanta. So as a result of this, we basically don't know much about what's happening on the ground. And apart from the stories that are that have crossed the border to Sudan with the refugees who are now in the Sudanese side of the borders. Dr. Amira, can you tell us about the situation with the refugees, of the new refugees of this conflict?
Okay, so as you pointed, Hussam, refugees are now probably the primary source of information of what is happening on the ground in the Tigray region. And what we know from them is that civilians are being bombed and murdered, and they say it's quite a substantial number of casualties. We don't know the numbers. We cannot estimate what's happening, and these are eyewitnesses. They are not experts in the area. But these people walk for long distances under bombs, and sometimes in open air, and sometimes under the trees, try to cross the border from Tigray into Sudan. And sometimes their mobility is curtailed by soldiers. Of course, at the moment, every party is coming of the story. But what we know is that the Tigray region is a host actually for almost 6% of the Ethiopian population, and this is a large number. These are 6 million people, and these people are potential internally displaced or refugees. And of the region is already underdeveloped, and 2 million of these people in humanitarian need. So at the moment, as yesterday, we had 43,000 people, Tigraynian, crossing the border to Sudan. And this is an 4,000 people fleeing every day to Sudan. More than of these people are children. So we're witnessing a humanitarian disaster on the making. So there is also the estimates that in the next few months, 5 or 6 months, this number might rise to be 200,000 people. This is a lot already. And of course, on the other side of the border in Sudan, we have another humanitarian situation. We have a state that cannot accommodate for the needs of its own citizens, let alone people who are coming from abroad. The moment refugees from Tigray are being hosted in Umra Kuba camp that was built in the 80s for Ethiopians who had to flee Ethiopia as of the famine. It was closed, and now it's reopened again to host the Tigraynians. So probably before we talk humanitarian crisis on the ground in the other side of the border in Sudan, probably you can give a little bit of history, as you requested me to do so, Hussam, before the episode. And we know that this is not new. I mean, Sudanese arriving into Ethiopia or into Eritrea or vice versa is not new. There are 3 countries that probably we can make the history of refugees in the world. But in terms of Ethiopian refugees and Eritrean refugees in Sudan, this is Africa's longest standing refugee. Sudan, of course, is a classical destination and transit site for these people. Some of them live in camps, only 80% of them live in camps because it has a very, very restricted encampment policy. But also some of those people are live in urban setting, and this is, of course, these people are, we can call them protracted refugees, because half of them, those who lived in Sudan even before the arrival of the Tigrayan refugees, half of them were born already in Sudan, so they have lived there for less than 20 or 30 years. Of course, this is not the first wave. This is actually the 3rd wave of mass displacement from Ethiopia. We all know that during the Derg in 1974 to 1991, and there was another one during the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea in 1998 to 2000. So this is now the 3rd one. We have already an issue of protracted displacement. Sudan as a transit country, we have issues of smuggling and trafficking. Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees are important actually targets for this criminal. But also compared to other countries, Sudan provides some sort of like space for Ethiopians, and that's why we can see refugees and migrants live side by side in cities, in the cities of Sudan, and they are migrant workers. They have their communities, and there are large, of course, diasporic communities of Sudanese, of Ethiopian and Eritreans in Sudan. At the moment, in terms of the humanitarian situation, we spoke about these people fleeing and in large numbers, and the humanitarian actors are actually standing behind meeting these needs. Reporters, friends, Noor, Mohammed Amin, had field visits to the borders, and Shamail, for example, wrote in one of her evidence that people, the minute they see you, they say food, 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 or if they speak Arabic, they say ja'anin, we are hungry, because the food that's provided to them is hardly enough. They are served with small amounts of lentils and porridge, which is not enough for anybody. There is only one health center that's run by Mercy Corps, and they have already reported large numbers of widespread malnutrition, hepatitis, AIDS, and of course, probably corona. Corona was already detected in Tigray before the war, and there were people in isolation. We don't know what happened to them at the moment. So the minute that these refugees arrive to the border, they are received in a registration center run by the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It's called the Hamidite, and then from Hamidite, they either Village 8 or they go to the refugee camp in Rakuba, in Rakuba. So a number of accommodations, as you can see, are not enough, but also in Village 8, where there are more accommodation, there is an access problem. Refugees are supposed to stay there only for registration, but they stay for long days because of the shortage of the fuel. Again, the communication issue, so they take time. So this is apart from some interventions, of course, I mean, there is a humanitarian appeal, like any refugee situation, any refugee crisis in the making. And again, it's not enough. So we're witnessing a large and actually probably I can see that's going to continue, just like, you know, how Ethiopians are staying and Sudanese in Ethiopia as well have been there for decades. And I think this is the time that probably we need to do something more meaningful to these refugees.
Thank you, Dr. Amira. What about if you can say more about or talk more about what the international community, or not only the UNHCR and Mercy Corps, or what are they doing? The international community, the countries, organizations, NGOs, including the governments of Africa or the region or the international world. What are they doing now to help in this refugee crisis?
Making the same mistake over and over and over again, and it seems that nobody is really learning from history. They're looking at the refugee situation as temporary. And Sudan, of course, has a reservation on Article 51 Geneva Convention relating to the rights of refugees, and this is concerned with the freedom of movement. So again, Sudan has, just to give Sudan also some justice about the refugee protection regime in Sudan, Sudan used to be an excellent example of as hospitality for refugees. And they have, I would say, you know, probably the best refugee protection regime in the region, as early as refugee regulation law. And
as early as what? Sorry, the internet code. I mean, the connection was bad.
1974.
1974. Yeah. Okay.
1974, before you were born, Hussam. Yeah.
Before most of us were born.
Sudan had. Hear me now?
Yeah.
I know I'm. Can you hear me now? Is it better now?
It is. Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm so sorry about. So just to give a little bit of context about how refugees are treated or protected in terms, of course, of the legal and institutional infrastructure. So I don't want to take you to many details, but in general, migration scholars look at the types of systems, government systems in relation to refugees, liberal regime, exclusionary regime, and indifferent regime. So Sudan was used as an example of a liberal regime that allows the integration of refugees and they're probably giving them large rights as compared to other countries in the region. We see that Sudan, unfortunately, is moving a little bit to an indifferent regime, and I would see early signs of an exclusionary regime. We saw that a few months ago when the refugees were rounded up and were taken to prison and were made to pay. So anyway, so in capitalizing on that regime, I think we could do something in the future. So at the moment, it's international actors are they opened an airlift from the Gulf. This is their storage for food supplies and medical supplies. So there is a direct transfer for this provision of assistance from the Gulf into borders to Iranian refugees. So I think on the short term, this is what should be done. And I have a number actually of probably recommendations, if you like, to the Sudanese government. Maybe I can wait until some people.
So we'll talk about we'll talk about the recommendation. So, the international community is failing to learn from the lessons of the past in the refugees crisis. Abraham.
Yes, they are failing to learn from the past. If you allow me, Hussam, and also we see again the same. Visits, I mean, if you want to be famous now, go to Cuba and take a picture there. You will be all over the news. So we see all this, people going there. And we know that after like probably 5 or 6 months, we'll get what they call the fatigue, the donor fatigue, and the humanitarian fatigue. So they will leave all this behind their back and move on with another crisis.
Okay. Unfortunately. So Dr. Abraham, so this is what the international community is doing for the refugees. You were one of the signatories, you and Ayanto, of a letter that you published and circulated the first few days of the conflict, bringing to light what is happening, and also coming with recommendations, with a few steps required to see the way out of this conflict. Can you tell us more about what the international community is doing, or the efforts of de-escalating the conflict now, and whether you see that they are likely to succeed or to fail, or what we or the international community should do differently?
Later, we have tried to address at least different parts. First, the actors, the TPLF, the Tigrayan Front, and the central government to de-escalate the conflict. Second, international community like UN and IGAD, AU to intervene and then try to mediate the conflict. And third, notable African leaders like former president of Liberia, Ilan, former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, Olusegun Obasanjo, and others, to intervene and mediate. Again, other thing was to de-escalate the war rhetoric by the media outlets, both traditional media and social media users. But as we have seen it the last days, all of the leaders, whether with our calls or with their programs, they have been to Ethiopia, like Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, and others were delegated by the African Union to mediate the conflict. And Abiy resisted to host them. And he says, since they call it the operation of capture, what's called operation of something, he says, until we capture the fugitives, we'll not be dealing with them on equal terms. So basically, they met him and it doesn't work, of course, it doesn't work. And then Magala is now captured. And the worst would come now. We are afraid that the worst would come. This is the beginning of a never-ending conflict. Because as of now, I'm not sure what happened to the leaders, the Tigrayan leaders, those who have been leading the conflict. Again, we don't know how they will also handle the internal refugees, internally displaced population of Tigray. We don't know what will happen to about 100,000 Eritrean refugees who are held in Tigray. Some of the news were saying Eritrean defense force entered the refugee camps and they were trying to capture them and then send them back to Eritrea. I can't confirm this, but if this happens, it's a worse crisis because they have fled from the region in Eritrea for their safety, and then if they are captured from a second country and then return back, it will be another crisis. But as Amira was saying, unless we try to learn from history, this will just repeat itself. And now we are seeing them in the beginning of just never-ending conflict. And unless we intervene it quickly and say, we have to deal it this way, and unless we allow other international organizations to intervene or to, kind of play their role, we'll have a cycle of conflict.
Okay.
May I add quickly?
Sure.
I just want to reiterate what everyone has said, but I also want to add a little bit of a historical context. What we call the international community, specifically the Western states, have been failing Ethiopian people. They've been failing historically marginalized groups in Ethiopia. After the 1991 transition, they allowed and enabled and supported the TPLF to exile, to kill, and to jail members of the Oromo Liberation Front. They knew that this was the genuine party of the Oromo people, and they allowed TPLF to establish its dictatorship. Again, with Abiy Ahmed, because Abiy Ahmed's first problem wasn't going to war in Tigray. In Oromia, he has either put in jail or driven out of the country his political opponents, people like Jawar Mohammed, Bakala Garba, so many others. At the same time, the grassroots movement that brought him to power has been totally attacked and eliminated through mass killings, mass jailings. Just between July and August, over 30,000 people in Oromia alone were jailed. People were jailed in schools that were turned into jails. So there was this massive crisis that has been unfolding, which the international community knows and which they have allowed to occur. And so now when this war happened, they continued to support Abiy Ahmed. The US, for example, still supports him. And so there's this failure by the international community to not consider the needs of the actual people, whether it's Ethiopians or it's another African country. There's no prioritizing the people themselves who have to live with this crisis.
Okay, so this is a very, very dark picture of the international community's interventions. What do you think then can be well, not the best outcome, but the way out of this. What in your view, knowing the realities on the Ethiopian politics, the Ethiopian front, as well as the international regional fronts, what do you think? So we heard Abraham's recommendations, or like what they are asking each one to do. What are you asking people to do here? Different parties.
So we have, from the DERG to EPRDF, we have over 30, 40 years of history that shows us when you support one central authoritarian government in Ethiopia, you are opening way for a huge humanitarian crisis. You are opening way for fights to secede from Ethiopia. Autonomy fights will continue. The international community could learn from its own mistakes in 1991, and again in 2018, when they supported Abiy Ahmed, even as he began to sideline people who created the conditions for change. I would say immediate release of all political prisoners in Ethiopia, of people of the Oromo Liberation Front, people of the Oromo Federalist Congress, but also other political prisoners who are not Oromo. There's Sidama political prisoners, there's Amhara political prisoners, there's a lot of Tegaro political prisoners. The release of all of them, and also the release of the grassroots activists who were not only prevented from actually participating in the transition, but who were attacked and jailed. So Ethiopia needs a comprehensive national dialogue and a transitional government that is inclusive. Otherwise, we are headed for another cycle of conflict, and we know what that produces because the past is right there if we're willing to learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanto. Ustaz Faisal, I want to ask if you have any confirmed reports or any ideas about any international interventions in the military operations right now. So we know the tension that has been building up between Ethiopia and Egypt about the dam. Although Sudan was, especially after the transitional government came to power, tried to play an intermediate role, not being sidelining with either Ethiopia or Egypt, but we've seen very high-level visits from both the Egyptian military as well as the Ethiopian military to Sudan. And only a couple of weeks ago, there were military exercises by the Egyptian Air Force with the Sudanese Air Force in Merawi, in northern Sudan. And while preparing for this episode, I read also that, well, there are stories about possible drone attacks from the port of Asab that are orchestrated or can be orchestrated by the United Arab Emirates. Knowing that in the telephone call between President Trump, General Burhan, and Prime Minister Dr. Hamdok, and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump said something about the patience of Egypt, the Egyptian authorities of not attacking the dam. Are these stories? Are these? Do we have evidence that any of the above has happened or is happening? Are there real threats of them happening if they haven't yet happened? What do you see the role of Sudan, Egypt, and the other regional powers and Eritrea, of course, and maybe Abraham, you can also add. Apart from the stories about the Eritrean forces returning some of the refugees back to Ethiopia. So do we see a path here of further escalation of the military operations with all these actors?
Well, with what of happening now inside Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, we can see that there is real a human rights crisis, there is real war, and this war will not remain in Ethiopia. This is a lesson which is to be learned. We have experienced it many other places. So Khartoum definitely will determine whether the conflict will remain local or it will be a regional war. For that issue, the visits, there is a lot of intelligence wars before this war, and there is a lot of communication between Sudan itself now. We can't say that now we are in the revolution time. Sudan is a non-alignment country now. Sudan is still under this military council rule. Still, there is a lot of things happening in the region. So each and everything is expected. The escalation of this war is possible, but definitely the war will not remain in Ethiopia, will not remain in Sudan. It will go either Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea, and so on. So the most important thing is how can the Khartoum government think on this issue. We have heard and we have seen and we have listened to the first trial for intervention by Dr. Abdullah Hamdok, the Prime Minister of Sudan, to mediate. But the first step was he was supposed to mediate in the name of IGAD, as he's the chairperson of IGAD, but that was blocked. Again, there is another South African mediation, it was also blocked. Another hidden discussions were done in Uganda, Kampala, and it was blocked. I think now the region is under fire. Let us say that the region is under fire. The region is coming into a big war, which needs the intervention of the international community. How the international community will intervene, that is the issue. I believe, and I know, and we have experienced in many other countries, if the international community, I mean the Security Council, if they want to stop this war, they have the means to do it. But there is a lot of politics, and they want things to be, they want to weaken this region, they want to make new, maybe territories, new areas, new countries, new whatever. But I don't count on the African in initiatives. I don't count in the regional initiatives. I count on the people's way. How we, as human rights defenders, we as civil society, how can we do ourselves in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Eritrea, to build a civil society which can be able to stand up and say, let us build a peace movement in this region. Unless we manage to build a peace movement in Ethiopia, a peace movement in Sudan, a peace movement in Eritrea, it's difficult to wait for the international community to come to solve our problems. So I think we are in difficult time and we need to do more. How we can do it? We, as civil society, we have a role to play, I think.
Thank you, Ustaz Faisal. So as we come to a close to this interview, I'd like to hear final thoughts of you. Dr. Amira, let's start by your recommendations, and then we will have everyone else talk. You're on mute, Amira. Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So, so refugees continue to arrive, and there are, of course, humanitarian intervention that are taking place on the ground, but they are not organized, they are not harmonized, and they are not designed to take. I mean, they are designed based on a temporary mentality that refugees are here only temporary. So I think at this point, the government of Sudan should be reminded that fulfill their ethical commitments. They are signatories to conventions and treaties related to the protection of refugees, probably most importantly, the 1969 African Union Convention governing the specific aspects of refugees problems in Africa. So even though the local authorities are quite accommodating and is opening camps, or there are already existing camps in Gadaref. So HAC said that the Sudan Humanitarian Aid Commission said that they are going to reopen these shelters or camps to accommodate the refugees. But I think what's lacking at the moment and what needs to be immediately done is that Sudan devise its own humanitarian response plan and its own appeal. And from their efforts.
Your line is breaking, Amira. Can you repeat the last point, please?
Guidance, and you need them, of course, because we're a very poor country. But at least you have to be in control of how these efforts so they can be effective and sustainable. So I think this is the first thing that needs to be done. Also, we hear about, even though there is a great hospital which is praised by many observers, but also some witnesses from Gadaref spoke about violation of police violence, border guards violence, and even rape on the borders. I think the government of Sudan should take serious actions to suppress any violations or abuses against refugees. On the longer term, I think it's very important to shift our mentality. I'm never tired of repeating this. We should shift our mentality looking at refugees as temporary. Refugees are not temporary, and refugees are not a security threat. Refugees are in need of security and protection. This is very important. I think also Sudan has issues with their migration and visions. They need to work on that. They need to probably have an effective division of roles within government institutions. I think we need to revisit the Khartoum process that prevented many people to go to their traditional routes of migration, but instead they are now stuck in Sudan, and we hear a lot about smuggling and trafficking before of that. I think also more important, Sudan also needs to consider integration as one of the durable solutions as per the international refugee law, and refugees to work and free movement. And because again, this is a protracted crisis. I don't think the war will end tomorrow or next year. The Syrian crisis that started 10 years ago, we gave temporary accommodation and they have been there now for 10 years. So I think we should look at that. And finally, I think also Sudan needs to involve the diasporic communities and the community-based organizations that are already existing in Sudan. I think they're very, very important to involve them and to hear their voice in any, before implementing or even any plans to address this refugee situation. And just to answer your question, what can be done? Stop the war, end the war. I don't know how this can happen, but I think this is the only solution that can save us all this human suffering and all these humanitarian complications.
Thank you, Dr. Amira. Ustaz Abraham, Mr. Abraham, Dr. Abraham, can you also give us your final thoughts here?
Ayanto is saying the international community has consistently failed to heed to Ethiopia's mainly Oromos or other minorities problems. And we are seeing now other actors are failing. And unfortunately, we have the worst governments, like 3 countries have the worst government, which work against their own people. So as Stas Faisal was saying, I think the last resort is just go back to civic society and just build up kind of collaborative networks to stand against that kind of abuse of power.
Thank you, Dr. Abraham. Thank you. Ustaz Faisal, last thoughts?
Well, before saying my recommendations, I want to just to comment on what is being said on Sudan historically and up to date. I don't think that we should give this rosy picture of the Sudan role in dealing with refugees. I mean, we have been working on human rights for decades, and we have been monitoring and reporting and documenting the Sudanese authorities' oppression and suppression and abuse of refugees' rights in Sudan. We have many of documentation. So we need, as Dr. Amira said, we need to call upon the Sudanese government to respect their international obligation on the issue of refugees, to respect their international obligation of taking care of all those who have managed to cross the borders into Sudan. They have to be dealt to respect their dignity, to respect their rights as people who are running from wars. And also I can see that the Sudanese media still were not yet up to date. And we have our own, reasons why the Sudanese media is not yet up to date. We have seen reporters coming from Gulf countries, reporters coming from international media, going into the war zones, along with our colleagues also who are going to the war zones, but still things are not clear. The Sudanese media must play its role. We have to say clearly that there is no anything which is that can say that any government has right to kill its people, or any rebellions or opposition groups or whatever had right to comment human rights atrocities. What is happening now in this region is human rights atrocities, and we should raise up our voices. We should stand up as civil society, as human rights community, as human rights defenders, at least to monitor, to report, to document, and to see that the people of Ethiopia and the people of Sudan, people of Eritrea, people of the world have the right to know what is happening in this region. And we need to push for peace movement. Let us think of how we can build this peace movement. I hope SudanBukra one day will have a meeting like this for us to communicate on what is to be done. Thank you so much for my colleagues. I learn a lot from you.
Thank you, Ustaz Faisal. Ayanto, we'll give you the last word here, and you're on mute. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I feel like I have already, said what I think in terms of a comprehensive, all-inclusive dialogue, and I think a transitional council of some sort to get Ethiopia ready for elections. And I want to remind listeners that in 2018, when Abiy Ahmed came to power, he was supposed to prepare Ethiopia for free and fair elections, so people could actually have a real election for the first time since EPRDF took over. That did not happen. I also want to say people need to be clear about who Abiy Ahmed is and what he's fighting for. He's fighting to centralize power in Addis Ababa. That means that all of his opponents who are in jail, who are in prison, are likely to remain there. Just this morning, the government has released arrest warrant for activists and intellectuals in the diaspora. People like Awol Alo, Ismail Gabisa, Itana Habte. These are professors in American universities. And so you see like EPRDF is here in spirit, it's here in how things are done. So like people really need to accept that Abiy Ahmed is not a move in a different direction. He is several moves back to where we were in 2018 when he came to power.
Which is sad, but thank you very much. I learned a lot from you. Thank you, and I hope that the audience also learns a lot of this conflict, of the history of the conflict, not only the history but the context of the bigger context of the conflict and in the political environment in the region. Not only in Ethiopia, but in the Horn of Africa. I thank you once again for coming to SudanBukra and joining this interview. Thank you, Dr. Amira Ahmed, the professor in the American University in Cairo and expert in migration and refugees. Thank you, Dr. Abraham Zer'i, the Eritrean journalist in exile based in the United States. Thank you, Ustaz Faisal Al-Baqir, the Sudanese journalist and human rights defender based in Kenya. Dr. Amira Sudanese, I forgot that, of course. Yeah, and thank you, Ayana, the PhD student, Ethiopian Oromo activist based in the United States. Thank you to the audience of SudanBukra برنامج وإن طال السفر. شكرا جزيلا لكم ونلتقيكم في حلقة قادمة والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
شكرا.